Well, thanks on that, Cliff. I guess we'll move ahead with today's discussion. And as usual, a lot to discuss. For our top news, Biden vows to slash U.S. emissions by half to meet the existential crisis of our time. That's important. In technology and electric vehicles, the China tech stampede into electric cars has sparked auto sector buzz. Like this, I think that by 2030, more than 90% of new cars sold in China will be smart EVs. In 2D materials, there's a nanomaterial MXene, which apparently is the perfect lubricant. In space and physics, NASA's Perseverance Mars rover extracts first oxygen from Mars from the red planet. I wonder if that's going to be very important. In environment and energy, experts' predictions for future wind energy, the experts' prediction are that the cost will drop significantly. In biology, there's a story about DNA robots who can potentially do so much. And these robots can be designed in minutes instead of days. In the brain, artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to identify emotions. Now, what do you think would be at stake in that? Now, medical stuff around HIV. The first human trial of HIV vaccine has produced an immune response apparently in 97 of volunteers. Wow. So let's get on to it with the top story. And Richard, what's this about Biden vows to slash U.S. emissions by half in order to meet this crisis of our time?
Now, one of the things to me that is actually extraordinary about this, and you'll hear as we go along, is the change in the language that is being used by the U.S. administration now. Now, Biden has called on the world to confront the climate crisis, and he says, quote, overcome the existential crisis of our time. And this includes a new pledge to slash U.S. emissions by half at the end of this decade. So that's a fairly aggressive uh, goal. And Biden is warning that time is short. Again, what a change in attitude from different uh, administrations. And specifically, he now is committed the U.S. to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
So, Richard, we can't hear you, or at least I can't.
Okay. Can
I have
anybody else?
no problem.
I'm hearing okay.
I can hear you.
Okay. Well, uh, okay, so everybody but Fred can hear me. You just have to read my lips, Fred. So, anyway, again, Biden has committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by between 50 and 52% uh, by 2030. He also reiterated his commitment to move U.S. energy production entirely to renewables by 2035. And uh, while he was doing this, he still made, I think, a slam at China. And this is his quote. He says, particularly those of us that represent the world's largest economy, we have to step up. And I think that is particularly aimed at China. China, like a lot of countries in the world, is committed to get to zero net emissions, but their commitment is 2060, and the U.S. commitment is 2050. And that's similar to what is being committed in other places like Europe. So China, who is the biggest polluter, has they're committed, they say, to zero emissions, but it's not for a long time. And I think they need to do more sooner, and I think Biden does with his comment. He says the moment demands urgency. Good ideas and good intentions are not enough. And besides the U.S. with their commitment, now there's a new announcement that came from Japan, and Japan says they will slash emissions by 46% by 2030. And South Korea says they will not finance any more overseas coal projects. And Canada also increased their goal. And again, the U.S. representatives are saying the U.S. isn't going to wait. The costs of delay are just too great, and our nation is resolved to act right now. So I think this is the strongest high level commitment that I have heard. Uh, and I'm encouraged. Now all they have to do is do what they say they're going to do.
Any thoughts?
Well,
Well,
have
one,
you seen any responses to that from our friends, the Republicans?
What global warming, they say?
Well, I do see that on television they now have quite frequently a rather uh, expensive ad where the fight for global warming means more than just reducing global warming, but it means jobs of all sorts and union jobs, that sort of thing. There's a clear attempt to sell the idea to the average worker.
Well, certainly there's an opportunity for somebody here because the world is, in the next 20 years, going to spend billions of dollars on projects to reduce greenhouse gases. And one of the things that it means is uh, not only jobs, but products to sell to make the next great carbon sequestration device, for example. The country that makes the best one of those is going to sell a lot of them. Remember when the U.S. used to lead and stuff like that? I wonder if we're frozen. I don't see any movement. Hello, are we there? Are we there? Are we? Uh-oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry you lost me. What I was going to say was people talk about how China is not going to be able to cut their emissions and it's not fair. And what does it matter if China's going to be emitting so much? But my ethical question is, since I think it's true that the United States is contributed at an inordinate, disproportional amount to even more so to set high standards and try to cut back our emissions, regardless of what anybody does anywhere else.
Well, one thing about this that's it's absolutely impossible for what Biden says, because right now the emissions are about 50% higher than they were in 2005. So to effectively cut them to half of what they were in 2005 will require a 2/3 reduction in overall emissions. And when you think that there's less than and to make these kinds of
Just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't try for our own preservation. Look what's happening in the United States with the storms, the hurricanes, the fires in the West and everything. We have to try as hard as we can. And the United States they're very good at dealing with challenges. So, we got to try.
And my point,
even
you have to establish and win the argument first. If people are crying about China and not owning up, just like the racism in America, if you don't own up to the problem, you can't even talk about reparations. If you don't believe in climate change, you can't talk about solutions. If you don't own up to the responsibility the United States has because we've been an overwhelming contributor, you can't even aspire. So I agree with Johannes that we should aspire to do the most we can, even if I agree we're not going to be able to reach that. At least we can set the standards as high as we can and do our best. But again, you have to own up to the contribution in a negative sense that we've made.
Just following up on what Cliff said, and I missed some of it a little while ago. What proportion? We're talking about half and that kind of thing rather than volume. And I wonder how much of the world's emissions does the United States already produce? Doesn't it produce a lot more than China does? Where is that at?
I don't know the number, but I'm going to start Googling.
And another thing to think about is there's a fellow named Dr. Steve Koonin, who's he was a science advisor to President Obama in Obama's first term. And he's released a new book called Unsettled, What Climate Science Tells Us and Doesn't Tell Us. And in that book, he quotes all of the IPCC reports and says that the politicians are cherry picking out the worst case results in the IPCC reports, and the variability in the predicted outcomes is so large that it's unrealistic to imagine we're going to see things like a 6-meter rise in the sea level and stuff like that. Worth Googling.
I'm currently that China contributes twice as much as the United States, according to just a quick Google that I took. It was like 10 gigatons or something of carbon dioxide by China, 5.4 by the US, 2.65 by India, 1.7 by Russia. Of course, that's 1 year. If you take the integral function of the last 100 years, I would love to do that right now, but I would guess the US is about 80% of the total integral function over the course of the history of the planet Earth. I don't know. Does anybody know?
The other thing is we're predicting what's going to happen so many years from now. We're forgetting that science advances all the time. There's going to be inventions and methods that we don't even dream about that is going to be there before that target date.
Well, and it's correct that there'll be these new technologies, but the reality is when new technologies come out, they take years before they move from the prototype stage to wide application. And there's a good book by Vaclav Smil out called Growth. And he looks at all of the technologies that have arisen in the last 200 years and shows how long it takes for these things to happen. So,
But
But
if you look with that book and look at, for example, how long it took cell phones to, smartphones to penetrate half of the market, you see that this technology growth recently has been a lot faster than the traditional growth patterns.
like the COVID vaccine, that happened.
Richard, moving on. What's this about China stampeding into electric cars?
I think this will turn out to be a bigger deal than most people are aware of. China is the world's biggest market that looks like they are going to be rapidly electrifying. Uh, China Tesla has made a big impact in China, and now there are a number of Chinese tech firms that you don't think about as automobile manufacturers that are getting into the EV business uh, with massive investments. And they're actually moving past the simple EV business to wanting to have smart electric vehicles and autonomous cars. So they're going to push this very heavily. And in recent weeks, among others, the Chinese smartphone giants Huawei and XIAOMI, who I haven't heard of, but is a big smartphone manufacturer now, and e-commerce leader Alibaba, and company DJI, who's the world's top drone manufacturer, have all said that they're going to be developing EVs and smart electric cars. China, their auto market is about a third of the world's auto market. So this is significant for the world's market. And again, examples of this, the company Xiaomi, which has become one of the world's biggest smartphone suppliers, plans to invest $10 billion over the next decade in smart EV subsidiary. Hawaii will invest $1 billion this year. Alibaba is making a deal with Japanese manufacturer Honda to ramp up their autonomous vehicle testing on Chinese road. And then there's another tech giant, Baidu, who I haven't heard of either. And it has said recently they make an autonomous navigation system called Apollo, and they say in the next 3 to 5 years, this is going to be on 1 million vehicles. And the autonomous driving remains largely in the testing phase in China, but they are widely expected to take the lead due to government encouragement and also a modern infrastructure with a head start in deploying 5G networks, which apparently will be required for these autonomous vehicles. And to just give you an example, there recently was the Shanghai Auto Exhibition, the biggest auto show in China. 4 years ago, it was dominated by traditional internal combustion engines. This year, pretty much every booth in the hall has electric vehicles and their planned autonomous driving vehicles. And uh, one of the problems is a number of these new entrants are basically technology companies, and they have no automaking know-how at all. And so, really, for them to enter the business, they have to partner with somebody who knows how to make things like this. And they'll be providing the brains of the car while the manufacturing companies provide the bodies. And this is not like Tesla, who is doing it all themselves, including making the batteries. Another problem they all will have is a global semiconductor shortage. I think that is going to be fairly short-lived because there are billions of dollars being spent on new capacity now. And there are people in in China who are knowledgeable about this, who are saying they're very uh, optimistic, and they think by 2030, which is just 10 years from now, less than 10 years, he says more than 90% of the new cars sold in China will be smart EVs. So maybe that'll help China's pollution.
Any thoughts?
Well,
I
some states like Ohio, you get punished if you have an electric vehicle. You pay more for your license, while in Europe, you get a tax break if you have an electric vehicle. So some of the laws have to change. They basically say if you have an electrical vehicle, then you're not buying gasoline, so you're not paying gasoline taxes. So therefore, we've got to slap it on the license.
In Mexico, if you go to an EV charging station, the charge is free.
Um, your comment about non-car makers making electric cars, I think Johannes and I can attest. I've been driving an electric car for 7 years. Nothing ever breaks. There are no parts to break. So the non-battery related aspects of electric cars, there's just aren't a lot of things to break. So I don't think it's that
Right.
complicated. I also want to go back to my comment just to follow up. I Googled, I made a screenshot, sent it to you, Richard, about the contribution of the United States historically. At first glance, it was a long article. My sense is the U.S. has contributed about 20%, representing 5% of the world population. I'm guessing from the graph I looked at, it looked like about 20%. So I certainly overestimated it, but even that is, 4 times more than our population percentage. So Richard, you might want to just look at that graph.
I see the graph.
Okay, maybe look at it later, but it just to correct. I think I overestimated the historical contribution of the United States, and certainly at this point, other countries. There's a lot coming from the rest of the world besides the United States now.
Right. Well, that's what's happened when the U.S. starts to share prosperity with the rest of the world, is the rest of the world starts to pollute too.
And get obese and eat red meat. Yeah.
That's right.
Richard, what's this in materials about the perfect lubricant? A two-dimensional nanomaterial. What's that?
Well, the way they pronounce it is Maxine. That was the name of my mother. I'm not sure she's the perfect lubricant. But there are a lot of things that oil is good for. You can lubricate a bicycle chain with oil. But, if you have something in space or with very an atmosphere without a lot of atmospheric pressure, then the oil just evaporates. And also, if you're in something like a steel mill, there are parts of a steel mill where you have metal parts rubbing against each other that are several hundred degrees C hot, where just the oil would evaporate. So that's the problem. But this now is another use for 2D materials that I couldn't even imagine 2 weeks ago. And Maxine then takes a stack of atomically thin layers of titanium and carbon that each of the layers is stable on their own, but the layers move against the other layer very freely. And so this makes Maxine an excellent dry lubricant. And it turns out it has exceptionally high wear resistance. They have tested it up to 100,000 movement cycles and have seen no degradation in its performance. So this is a great lubricant. So if you need to lubricate your space vehicle or your steel production plant, now there is a new 2D lubricant that you can use. Okay. Hello there. I don't hear
So,
anyone.
Richard, we can't see you.
Okay, I can see you.
Maybe we could put that open to other people about the perfect lubricant. What?
Yes, please.
And can you see anybody else? I can.
I can see everybody except Mary Ellen. Again, I think we have funny internet today. I can see Andrew. He scratched his face
And he smiled.
and smiled. Okay, well, this is, I figure, that is usual with these 2D materials, that this is to inform the group, not to have a lot of discussion.
Well, then, if we're not having much discussion, how about getting oxygen from Mars using NASA's Perseverance? What's that?
I think this is a cool story. And so Perseverance, the rover, it has several different experiments and pieces of gear on it. And one of them is a toaster size experimental device called the MOXIE. And they liked acronyms. And MOXIE stands for Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment. I can see why they used the short name instead of the long name. And what MOXIE does is it heats up to a very high degree, about 800 C, and then at that high temperature, it's able to convert CO2 into oxygen with a waste product of carbon monoxide. And this is convenient for Mars' atmosphere, which is 96% CO2. So the significance of this for the space efforts really is not so much for oxygen for the people to breathe, but to burn fuel. Right now, the rocket engines we have to have more oxygen by weight than they have fuel. So say if you had 4 astronauts on the Martian surface, then to get them to take off again and return to the Earth, they would need about 15,000 pounds of fuel and 55,000 pounds of oxygen. And so if you had to ship 55,000 pounds of oxygen to Mars from the Earth, that is a very expensive proposition. And it turns out you can, what they want to be able to do is to ship one of these devices, a full size one that weighs about a ton, and it can produce those 25 tons of oxygen that they're going to need for the return flight. And so this particular experiment confirmed that on a Mars mission, we can plan it in such a way that we are able to get the majority of what we need to fuel the return flight out of Mars's atmosphere. So I think this is a big step in the Mars exploration and colonization.
Any comments?
I have a question and a brief parenthetical interlude, if I may. My question is there any way we could see this as leading to converting oxygen, carbon dioxide to oxygen on planet Earth and reducing carbon dioxide? And I am reminded of one of the greatest scientific stories in the history of the human race, which many of you may or may not know, which is the story of Fritz Haber. Who knows who Fritz Haber is?
I don't. Tell us,
I know
please.
he's the ammonia guy.
Yeah, Fritz Haber, Jewish scientist, Nobel Prize in 1918 for probably the most important invention in the history of the world. He figured out how to make ammonium from inert nitrogen gas, which allowed us to fertilize and ultimately feed the planet Earth. He also happened to invent poison gas, which led to the extermination of 6 million of his fellow Jews a few decades later, leading to his wife committing suicide and him atoning for his sins by moving to Israel. But I digress. It's one of the most interesting biographies and stories in history of science. Fritz Haber.
It's interesting too. You mentioned that a good book on that is by Václav Smil. I don't know if you're familiar with that writer.
No, but what back to is you think anyway, Richard, that we could convert carbon dioxide to oxygen on this planet, or is there any way to use
I
that?
think there are things that don't require as much energy that
And heat.
can take the carbon out of CO2, and there are a lot of those things that are in the development pipe. Some of the ones that I like best are essentially artificial photosynthesis. So you're using the power from the sun to extract the carbon from the CO2. This has been done. It's experimentally. They haven't got it scaled up adequately for it to be useful yet.
There are a
The
lot
other
of there's so many things out there on how to convert carbon dioxide. When I get into arguments with my climate change denier friends who are fast becoming acquaintances rather than friends, I must. They always, it began with it wasn't happening to it's happening, but it's not man-made to now it's too late. But what I've read from sociologists is that the main reason they don't want to hear the science is because the solutions, which is governments working together, is so unbearable, but they won't listen to reason. But you can't talk about, now they're saying it's too late. And we're thinking it may be too late. But until you acknowledge it, and the friends I know, they have no clue about the possible solutions. And I tell them, if you look into it, there's a gazillion things that have been talked about. But they,
Right.
of course, they have no clue. They didn't want to hear about it. But
And the thing about the removing the CO2 from the atmosphere, increasingly scientists are saying that this is going to be necessary, that just getting to uh, zero net emissions is not enough, and particularly it's not enough when you consider the impact of all of this stuff on the oceans. So,
agree.
so we're going to have to find ways for sequestration. There are a couple of large scale projects going on. I think one in Canada and one in Switzerland, where they are uh, doing some industrial scale removing of the carbon from the atmosphere. One puts it into some solid material that is buried, the other puts it into a liquid, and I don't know what they do with the liquid.
I think Bill Gates actually pays someone to, he sort of taxes himself for all the flying he does and pays one of those people to sequester enough carbon dioxide to minimize his footprint.
Okay,
And CO2 is relatively easy to compress and liquefy and put into deep formations. So
right,
it's very doable. But getting back to the oxygen on Mars, the experiment that they're doing uses really high temperatures, and they're probably using electricity at this point. But in the future, to scale the thing up, they'll need far more amounts of energy. So probably they'll use nuclear devices on Mars to get this oxygen. And then the other thing they're going to have to do with it is store it.
right.
And it's unrealistic to compress it, but Mars is relatively cold, so they could liquefy it and store it at relatively low pressure at very low temperatures. So
Okay,
that's very doable.
okay. Good
So,
point.
Richard, we want to move on to wind away from oxygen. How come wind energy costs are going to drop fantastically? What's all of that about?
Now, it's one of the other things that's hopeful. One of the things about wind technology is that the technological and commercial advancements have been so rapid that they have exceeded anybody's forecast that was ever made for both how cheap they're going to be and how broadly they will be used. And it looks like that's going to continue. Here, experts anticipate cost reduction up to about a third by 2035 and up to about half by 2050. So, however cheap they are now, it's going to be a lot cheaper in the future, and that's going to continue going down the cost curve for the next foreseeable future. And one of the things that's pushing it in the US is Biden signed an executive order in January where he's trying to maximize offshore wind potential and has identified wind power as a key component of the nation's renewable or renewed efforts to combat climate change. And we know what he said recently is he's increasing the goals for that reduction. And the biggest element that is driving the improvements in costs are bigger turbines. And if you look at what they're making now as opposed to what they're making a few years ago, they're able to get a lot more power out of the turbine. And it looks like those kind of increases are going to continue in the future. So they estimate now the land turbines that they have 10 or 15 years from now will be twice as powerful as the ones they have now. Another thing that they're looking at that is now really just in the pre-commercial stage is offshore wind, but this is not offshore wind like we think of presently. This is floating offshore wind, and floating offshore wind is a lot cheaper to deploy than having to have this structure that goes into the sea bottom to support all the weight and mass. And they say floating offshore, which basically doesn't exist now, they think that by 2035 it will be at least a quarter of the offshore electricity production. So as long as the wind keeps blowing, we're going to be able to get cheap and cheaper electricity from it.
Unless
Any
the
thought-
increased hurricanes destroy the floating wind turbines in the ocean.
I bet. But maybe if you know the hurricane is coming, you can hook it to a tugboat and get it out of the path.
It's interesting. The offshore windmills have been around for many decades in Scandinavia. If you look from Denmark, you can see all those windmills outside. And you spoke before about this Maxine lubricant.
Yes.
That might be able to help in reducing the friction in the windmills. And the other thing is they're finding ways now to store the wind energy using liquid hydrogen. So no longer depending on what's happening now, they can store some of that energy.
Yes. Now, I'll have a story next week about gravity storage. A company is getting big in using gravity storage as a battery. And with this, when you have excess power, you just lift up your weights. And when you need the power, you let them go and have them drive a turbine.
So, Richard, if we want to move on to biology, what's this about these amazing DNA robots that can be used for so many things in health, and that can be designed apparently not in days or weeks, but in minutes?
Well, DNA robots are one of the many things that I never heard of until I collected articles for this week's show. And the scientists believe that someday these tiny DNA robots will do things like deliver medicine inside our body, detect deadly pathogens, and help manufacture increasingly smaller electronics. And the thing that is going to be a big step forward is this new computer system that is called Magic DNA that is able to design DNA robots that are basically more than 3 times more complex than we could ever design before, and design them very, very quickly in just a few minutes. So that is going to increase their penetration and let them make more complex and more useful nano devices. And to me, one of the things that is particularly interesting is first the idea of a DNA robot that once it's injected into your skin can look around in your bloodstream and detect a pathogen, and they think they can make a more complex version of this DNA robot that is, and have it not only detect the pathogen, but also either release a drug into your system to kill the pathogen or to capture it. And so this is another new amazing technology that is coming out of the biological revolution that we are having in this century. And here, the people in the business are saying now they think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to start to see commercial applications for these DNA nano devices.
Any comments?
Does it replicate itself, or do you have to build each one individually?
You have to build each one individually presently.
Because one of the reasons, or one of the good things about your own immune system is you have thousands of different white blood cells. And when they detect a particular invasion species, then they multiply fantastically to deal with the invader.
Right. They talk about the vaccines, in fact, as training your white blood cells.
Yeah.
But no, so far they're going to have to make these.
Well, then, Richard, moving on to the brain. What's this about artificial intelligence being used to identify emotions?
Now, AI has been doing a lot of things, and we're familiar, of course, with the AI facial recognition. We're also familiar with some of the problems of this AI facial recognition uh, that are maybe cultural based on the training sets that it has. In the US, these AI facial recognition systems are better with white faces than they are with black faces. In China, their AI is better with the Chinese people than some of the tribal people around China. And so now imagine you're in a job interview, and as you answer all the recruiter's question, there's a camera connected to an AI system that is scanning your face and scoring you for nervousness, empathy, and dependability, and things like this. And it may sound like sci-fi, but these systems are increasingly being actually used in business, often without people's knowledge or consent. And this area is generally called emotion recognition technology, ERT. And though you may not have heard of ERT, it's already a multi-billion-dollar industry. And what they're trying to use is to use AI to detect emotion from facial recognition and facial expressions. The only problem with this is so far the science behind emotional recognition is not real solid, and that means it's even more of a problem than you might think. And it's being used already in situations that are pretty high stakes, like hiring, airport security, and in policing to identify dangerous people, and in education to monitor students' engagement. in homework assignments and things like this. What they're not saying in this article that I also know to be true is they're using this kind of emotional AI uh, in computer systems to recognize emotion when you see a product so they can know, hey, this is a good sales opportunity. And the facial recognition has gotten such problems now that a bunch of big high-tech companies, including Microsoft, Amazon, and IBM, have halted sales in their facial recognition systems, and they're trying to sort it out. But nobody has touched these emotional recognition systems, the ERT, and most of the ERT systems are based on a theory of basic emotions. And this theory holds that these emotions are biologically hardwired and expressed in the same way with people everywhere. The problem with that is research done in anthropology shows that emotions are expressed differently across different cultures. So here we have a multi-billion dollar industry that is based on an untested and false assumption, and there is no scientific support for the common assumption that a person's emotional state can be readily inferred from their facial movements. So, ERT has the potential to affect the lives of millions of people, but most people have never even heard of it. So, of course, there is very little public deliberation on how or if this should be even used.
Any thoughts?
I have a couple thoughts. Um, First of all, that article mentioned a new documentary on Netflix, which I've not watched yet, called Coded Bias.
Yes, yes.
And I added that to my list, and I'll be curious. I presume no one else has watched it, but I'll want to watch that. Second, is there's either good science or bad science. If it's good science, which it isn't yet, it sounds like, then the question is, how do we use it if we use it at all? The third comment is, I went to one of their websites to test it. And one thing I've discovered is, I think if you're over 65, chances are very good that we all have resting bitch face, which I certainly do. So that's unfortunate, but that's basically science. So I think if you plug in the science, yeah, you can probably figure out that if you're over 65, you have to cancel out the resting bitch face coefficient.
Uh-huh. And
It's
again,
it's another big difference.
Yeah.
There's another big difference, and that is cultural. For example, having spent half of my life in Europe, in United States, you're supposed to smile, to be pleasant, to be nice. So people in the United States, they smile much more, whether they mean it or not, where Europe faces are much more serious. So that's another.
But good science has to figure that in. It's bad science if you don't do studies to figure that factor in. You've got to put all those factors in, otherwise this is bad science.
right, and like they say, the anthropology says emotions are expressed differently in different cultures, and so we know that already.
Right. So you need to plug that in. If you don't know what person's culture is, then that's a confounding factor that should be plugged into the entire mess.
But on top of this is, I spent my working life in Silicon Valley working for technology companies, and I know kind of how they think. And they are driven by the idea of products that they can sell and make a profit on. And to a large degree, uh, the implications of these products are not considered at the time when they are developing them and releasing them and putting them in the world. So we have to catch up to these things later after Pandora already opened the box. Then we need to see if we can contain this next mad idea.
Well, in the United States, which is a country of immigrants, people come from all over the world. You have to ask them for their passport so you can use the right algorithm.
Well, you have to maybe get a DNA sample from them.
Well, Richard, on to our last story. What's this about an HIV vaccine that's hugely effective, 97%? What's that?
Now, this story actually has more to it than just an HIV vaccine. Here, with the first experimental round, phase 1 clinical trials, they found that this vaccine was able to get an immune response, stimulating immune cells that generate the particular antibodies that are useful against HIV, which is a fast mutating virus, is the problem. And these antibodies were detected in 97% of the participants. So they certainly have showed that these vaccines can be designed to produce the kind of rare immune cells that have specific properties that are needed to deal with HIV. And on one hand, this is very promising for HIV. HIV affects almost 40 million people in the world today, and though there are treatments, the treatments are ones that basically you have to use for the rest of your life, and it's expensive stuff. And part of this has biology elements that I don't know enough about to be able to comment on. The trial, they were targeting a kind of cell that occurs naturally in the immune system. Only about 1 in a million of these immune cells, so it's real rare, and they have to have the vaccine kind of prime these cells so that they can make what is necessary to recognize the HIV. And part of what they are excited about is that the targeting of these immune cells with specific properties called germline targeting is another new technology in vaccines, and researchers believe that this can also be applied for other vaccines which are hard to make presently, like influenza, dengue, Zika, hepatitis C, and malaria. And they say this vaccine is a tremendous achievement for vaccine science as a whole. So this is going to open up a whole new tool set for the use of making vaccines. And this clinical trial, they say, has shown that we can drive immune responses in predictable ways and make new and better vaccines. And following up on what somebody said going along, This study was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Any thoughts? Well, Richard, maybe we'll move on to next week. So thanks very much for today. And thanks to everybody for participating. And we'll see you in a week's time. All the best.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Yep.
Richard.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Adios.